The morning sun was barely up when I heard the roar of heavy machinery tearing through the quiet of my land. I ran to the edge of my property just in time to see my 100-year-old cedar fence being chewed apart by an HOA-ordered bulldozer led by none other than the self-proclaimed queen of the block, Karen. That fence wasn't just wood. It was a piece of my family's history, built by my grandfather's hands. And that morning, as splinters flew, I decided that Karen and her HOA had crossed the last line. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. The morning started like any other quiet, with the soft hum of birds waking up along the fence line. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee, standing on the porch, when I heard it. A harsh, grinding noise cut through the stillness. It wasn't the sound of a pickup truck or a tractor. This was something heavy, something tearing through wood. My stomach dropped. I set my mug down so fast I nearly cracked it against the railing and sprinted down the steps. By the time I rounded the barn, I saw at my cedar fence a piece of living history being ripped apart by a roaring bulldozer. The splintered wood flew like toothpicks, scattering across the ground I'd walked since I was a boy. And then I saw her Karen. She stood there with her arms folded, oversized sunglasses hiding her eyes but not her smug expression. She wore that stiff, starched blouse she always paraded around in during HOA meetings, like she was the sheriff of the neighborhood. "Stop," I shouted, my voice cracking with anger. I ran toward the bulldozer, boots pounding against the dirt. The operator slowed, hesitating, but Karen raised her hand like a queen giving orders. "Keep going," she snapped. "Turn it off," I barked at the operator. "You're trespassing on private property, and you're going to pay for this." Karen stepped in front of me, her face flushed with self-importance. "This fence violates HOA standards. It's falling apart. It's ugly. I told you we'd handle it, and now we are." My blood boiled. "Ugly," I yelled. "That fence is almost 100 years old. My grandfather built it with his own hands. It's stronger than anything you'll ever buy from a store." She smirked, clearly enjoying my fury. History doesn't matter when it's against the rules. We have standards here. I felt the heat rise to my face. This land has been here long before you or your HOA. You think your little rule book overrides a century of history over my dead body. The bulldozer's engine idled loudly behind us, filling the silence after my words. Karen tilted her head, stepping closer, her perfume thick in the dusty air. "You signed the HOA agreement when you moved in. Don't forget that. If you want to live here, you follow our rules. Otherwise," she gave a fake, sweet smile. "Maybe this isn't the place for you." That did it. I pulled my phone from my pocket, snapping pictures of the destruction. "You're going to pay for this. Every last board you tore down, every nail, every bit of damage. I'll see you in court if I have to." The bulldozer operator glanced nervously between us, clearly unsure if he should continue. I glared at him. "Shut it off. Now." Something in my tone made him obey. As the engine quieted, I walked to the fence line. I ran my hand along the broken wood, feeling the rough edges, smelling the cedar dust. Memories rushed in me at 10 years old, holding nails while my grandfather hammered, him telling me, "A fence is more than wood and wire. It's what marks your ground, what you protect." I clenched my fist. "You just tore down a piece of my family," I said quietly but firmly. "This isn't over, Karen. Not even close." Karen crossed her arms again. "Do whatever you want," she said with a mocking laugh. "But you'll find the HOA doesn't lose." I stared at her as she walked back to her white SUV, her heels sinking into the dirt. The sight of her smug grin burned into my mind. She thought she had me cornered. She thought I'd back down like everyone else she bullied. But she didn't know who I was. As the dust settled, I stood there, alone with the wreckage of my fence, the morning sun breaking through the trees. I felt a quiet rage building a fire that wouldn't go out until justice was served. I whispered under my breath, "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." I stood there long after the bulldozer left, staring at the splintered remains of my cedar fence. The smell of freshly torn wood clung to the air, sharp and bitter, like the feeling sitting in my chest. I ran my fingers over one of the posts, now cracked and broken, and I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again. He built that fence in the summer of 1925. I remember the story like he told it yesterday, how he and his two brothers cut every cedar log by hand, stripping bark with nothing more than a hatchet and sandpaper. "We built this fence to last," he'd say proudly, "because a man's land means nothing if he can't protect it." My grandfather was the kind of man who could work from sunrise to sunset without a single complaint. He believed in doing things right, not fast. Every post he planted was set deep in the ground, each nail driven with care. Even after nearly 100 years of storms, floods, and droughts, that fence was still standing until today. Karen didn't just knock down wood and nails. She ripped through a piece of my family's story. I walked the fence line slowly, remembering the times I'd helped my father patch it as a boy. Dad would hand me the hammer and say, "Your granddad would want you to take care of this place like your own bones. Someday, this'll be yours, son. Don't ever let anyone take it from you." And now here I was, watching it be destroyed by someone who didn't care. I sat down on one of the larger logs, my jeans scraping against the rough surface, and let the anger settle into something colder, a resolve. Karen thought she could bully me with her HOA rulebook. Maybe she'd scared off other neighbors before, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I pulled out my phone and opened the photo gallery. The pictures of the bulldozer tearing through my fence were sharp and clear, each one a nail in her coffin. I called the sheriff's office, explained what happened, and they promised to send someone out to take a statement. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just going to be solved with a police report. The HOA was powerful in this neighborhood. They had rules about everything: how tall your grass could grow, what color you could paint your mailbox, even how many vehicles could be parked in your driveway. I'd ignored most of their petty notices because I wasn't here to make my land look like a suburban postcard. I was here because this ranch was my bloodline. When I first inherited this property, I didn't think much about the HOA. I signed their stack of papers just to get them off my back, but I never imagined they'd come after something as sacred as the fence. Now I regretted not reading every word. As I walked back to the house, my boots crunching over the gravel, I thought about what Karen had said. Maybe this isn't the place for you. The nerve of that woman. She moved here less than 5 years ago and suddenly thought she could dictate who belonged on this land. No, I wasn't going anywhere. I stood on the porch and looked out across the open fields. Beyond the hills, I could see the wild horses moving in the distance, their manes flashing under the morning sun. They were descendants of the same horses my grandfather used to break in, free, untamed, and proud. Just like this land. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about a fence. This was about defending something bigger, my family's name, our legacy, and every drop of sweat that had ever been poured into this soil. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering every old photo I had of the fence. Some showed my father and grandfather working side by side. Others were from family barbecues, where the fence stood proudly in the background like a silent guardian. I scanned them, printed them, and started drafting a letter of complaint, not just to the sheriff, but to the HOA board itself. By evening, I had a thick folder full of evidence and a fire in my heart. But I knew Karen wouldn't back down easily. She thrived on control, on intimidating people. If I wanted to take her down, I'd have to be smarter than her. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the sunset bleeding across the horizon, and I made myself a promise. I'm not just going to rebuild this fence. I'm going to make sure Karen and her HOA pay for every single splinter they caused. And as I looked toward the distant hills, where the wild horses roamed freely, an idea started to form. It was crazy, maybe even reckless, but the kind of idea my grandfather would have grinned at. I wasn't ready to tell anyone just yet, but I knew one thing for sure: Karen had no idea what was coming. The morning after the fence was torn down, I woke with a pit in my stomach. I barely touched my coffee, staring at the wreckage of my cedar posts still scattered like broken bones along the property line. But before I could even think of my next move, I noticed a thick envelope in my mailbox. It had the HOA's official letterhead, the kind of formal design meant to intimidate. I tore it open, and my blood boiled before I even finished the first page. Notice of violation and restoration fee. It read in bold letters. According to Karen's board, my deteriorating fence had been removed for the betterment of community aesthetics, and I was being fined $2,500 for landscape cleanup and uniformity restoration. It was laughable, insulting, and outrageous all at once. They destroy my fence and then demand I pay them for it. I crumpled the paper in my hand, marched to my truck, and drove straight to Karen's pristine, perfectly trimmed home 3 streets over. Even from a distance, you could tell which house was hers. Every bush was shaped like it belonged in a botanical garden, and her driveway sparkled like she had someone power wash it daily. Karen was already outside, lounging on her front porch as if she'd been waiting for me. She wore a crisp white blouse and sunglasses the size of teacup saucers. When she saw me coming, she smiled like a cat toying with a mouse. "Well, good morning," she said, her voice sweet enough to make my teeth hurt. "I take it you got our notice." "Our notice," I shot back, waving the crumpled letter in her face. "You mean this piece of garbage? You tore down my fence, my grandfather's fence, and now you're demanding I pay you for it." Karen stood, tilting her head slightly, like she was speaking to a stubborn child. That fence was a violation of HOA standards. It was old, mismatched, and frankly, it didn't fit the look of our community. We're maintaining property values here. You should thank me." "Thank you," I nearly laughed. "You just destroyed a century-old piece of my family's history, and you think I should thank you." Her lips curled into that infuriating smile again. "Rules are rules. You signed the HOA agreement when you moved in, and those rules apply to everyone. No exceptions." I stepped closer, the heat rising in my chest. "That land was mine long before you and your little rulebook came along. You don't get to decide what stays and what goes." Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying the standoff. "The HOA always wins," she said coolly. "We have the power to enforce standards, and if you refuse to comply, we'll take further action." "Further action," I repeated. "Lady, you're already lucky I haven't called the sheriff on you for trespassing and vandalism." She didn't flinch. Instead, she sipped from her iced tea and gave me a slow, deliberate smile. "Go ahead. Call whoever you want. You'll find that the law and the HOA are not the same thing. We have our own ways of handling these conflicts." I could feel my fists clenching at my sides, but yelling wasn't going to get me anywhere. Karen fed on confrontation. She thrived on making people lose their cool, so I took a slow breath, let the silence stretch between us, and said, "You've crossed the line, and if you think I'm going to roll over, you're wrong." For just a second, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wasn't used to being challenged. On the way back home, I ran into my neighbor, Dave, who was mowing his lawn. He shut off the mower and waved me over. "Hey, I heard what Karen did to your fence," he said. "I'm sorry." "Man, she's been on a power trip lately." I narrowed my eyes. "Power trip? Yeah. She fined me last month because my mailbox wasn't the exact shade of white they wanted," Dave said, shaking his head. "She even threatened the Johnsons for having a shed that was too big. Everyone's sick of her, but no one wants to fight her. She's got the HOA wrapped around her finger." I crossed my arms. Maybe it's time someone did fight her. Dave gave me a look like I'd just said the impossible. "You think you can take on Karen? I don't just think it—" I said, my jaw set. "I know it. But I can't do it alone." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You've got me. If you're serious, that woman needs to be knocked down a peg." By the time I got home, I wasn't just angry anymore, I was focused. Karen thought she had all the power, but she didn't know the land like I did. She didn't know the history, the people, or the fact that I was willing to fight dirtier than she ever imagined. As I looked out toward the hills, I caught sight of the wild horses grazing. Their manes rippled in the breeze, free and untamed, and right then, an idea started forming in my head. It was bold, it was dangerous, but it would be the kind of payback Karen would never forget. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen's smug face and heard the splintering crack of my cedar fence being torn apart. By sunrise, I was already outside, pacing near the fence line with a fresh cup of coffee in hand, trying to figure out my next move. Fighting Karen alone was like wrestling a rattlesnake you could win, but not without getting bit. I needed backup. I started by visiting Dave, the neighbor I'd spoken to the day before. He was working under the hood of his old Ford pickup, grease smeared on his hands. "Morning," I said. "You serious about standing up to Karen?" Dave straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Dead serious. She's been running this place like a dictator. Last month she fined me for leaving my trash can out past noon. I was at work. How the hell was I supposed to move it?" I nodded. "I'm putting together a plan, but I can't do it alone. I need everyone she's pushed around to come forward." Dave gave me a slow grin. "You've got guts. Man, count me in. And I know a few others who are tired of her crap too." From there, we went door to door. Some neighbors were hesitant. Karen's reputation for retaliation was strong, but once I shared my story about the bulldozer, something changed. People started talking. I learned about Lisa, the single mom down the street, who got a warning letter because her kids' bikes were left on the driveway for too long. Then there was Joe, an old Vietnam vet, who got fined for having a flagpole that didn't meet HOA height standards. The more I listened, the more I realized Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was abusing her power. By mid-afternoon, I had 8 neighbors sitting around my back porch, each one with their own story of Karen's bullying. The air was thick with frustration, but also relief. For once, we weren't alone. She fined me $100 for having wildflowers instead of grass, Lisa said, shaking her head. "Can you believe that Wildflowers Joe leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms? This isn't a neighborhood anymore, it's a prison camp with her as the warden." I raised my hand to quiet the group. We've all been wronged, but the only way to stop her is to stand together. She can't pick us off one by one if we act as a unit. We need to hit her where it hurts the HOA board. Dave frowned. "You think we can flip the board? She's got those folks wrapped around her finger." "Then we find proof she's abusing her authority," I said firmly. "We document everything. Photos, letters, fines, every single time she stepped out of line. Once we have enough evidence, we take it to a meeting and demand a vote to remove her." Lisa perked up. "Can we do that?" "Absolutely," I said. "The HOA might have power, but it's still run by votes. If the majority wants her out, she's gone." The group murmured in agreement. For the first time, I saw hope in their eyes. But as we talked strategy, an idea kept nagging at the back of my mind, one that had nothing to do with paperwork or votes. I glanced toward the hills, where the wild horses were grazing, their silhouettes etched against the setting sun. I thought about how Karen prided herself on her perfect lawn, how she loved showing off her expensive landscaping during neighborhood tours. A slow grin crept onto my face. "I've got another card up my sleeve," I said. Joe raised an eyebrow. "What kind of card?" "Let's just say it involves a few unexpected guests in Karen's front yard," I replied. They all looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But then Dave chuckled. "You're talking about the wild horses, aren't you?" I nodded. "I know how to guide them down from the hills. My grandfather taught me how to corral them when I was a kid. If Karen thinks she can bulldoze my history, maybe it's time I give her a taste of untamed history running right through her perfect little lawn." Lisa covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. "You're crazy." "Maybe," I said with a shrug, "but it might just get her attention." We spent the next hour dividing tasks. Dave and Joe would gather all the HOA letters people had saved. Lisa would talk to the Johnsons, who had been silent for months out of fear. I promised to handle the horse problem, but only after we had enough evidence to back up our formal complaint. As the meeting ended and my neighbors walked home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: solidarity. Karen wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was fighting all of us. Later that night, I sat by the window, staring out at the fields. The moonlight bathed the broken fence in silver. I thought of my grandfather, of his calloused hands, and his unshakable belief in standing up for what's right. "Don't worry, old man," I muttered under my breath. "I've got this." The sound of wild horses echoed faintly in the distance, like nature itself was backing me up. I smiled, knowing that the storm was just beginning, and this time, Karen wouldn't see it coming. The idea of using the wild horses didn't leave my mind for a second. That night, I lay in bed listening to the distant thundering of their hooves across the hills. It was as if they were calling to me, daring me to do something bold. And the more I thought about Karen's smug face, the more certain I became this wasn't just a prank. This was going to be justice. The next morning, I drove my old pickup to the far western side of my property, where the land rolls into open fields. That's where the herd grazed most mornings. My grandfather used to tell me stories about these horses' descendants of the Mustangs that once roamed free before fences and towns cut across the plains. He always said they were a symbol of freedom, of the wild spirit that built this land. As I stood there, leaning on the fence post, I counted at least 100 of them, strong, beautiful animals with coats that glistened under the sun. They moved together, each step deliberate, like they had an unspoken understanding of the land. I whistled softly, a sound my grandfather taught me. A few of them lifted their heads, their ears flicking toward me. I wasn't a stranger to them. I'd spent years leaving hay and water out during dry summers, earning their trust. This plan had to be perfect. If I was going to bring these horses near Karen's pristine lawn, I had to control it. The last thing I needed was someone getting hurt. That evening, I met with Dave and Joe to share the details. We sat around a small fire pit in my backyard, the flames flickering as I laid out my strategy. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Dave asked, leaning forward. "Dead serious," I said. "Karen wants to treat my history like dirt. Fine. Let's see how her perfect little lawn holds up when nature pays her a visit." Joe chuckled. "I'd pay money to see her face when 100 wild horses show up on her front yard." "Yeah," I said with a grin, "but this isn't just for show. We need leverage. Once the HOA board sees how unstable Karen's leadership looks, they'll have to listen when we call her out." Lisa joined us halfway through the meeting, holding a stack of HOA letters from various neighbors. "She's been finding people left and right," she said, slapping the papers down on the table. "We've got enough to prove she's abusing her power." "Good," I replied. "We'll hit her with both barrels, public embarrassment and hard evidence, over the next 2 days." I prepared everything. I fixed the old corral gates on the western edge of my property and laid out fresh hay in a line leading toward Karen Street. Horses were curious by nature, especially when food was involved. I also set up a few low ropes and barriers to guide them safely along the path. But there was one thing I needed a distraction. If Karen saw me out there, she'd try to stop me before it even began. Dave volunteered without hesitation. "I'll keep her busy. Maybe pretend I'm asking about HOA rules or some nonsense. Trust me, I can talk circles around her long enough for you to get those horses moving." The night before the big move, I stood by the fence line again, watching the horses. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, and for a moment, I felt my grandfather's presence. He would have laughed at this plan, maybe even called me crazy, but he would have understood. "Tomorrow's the day," I muttered under my breath. "Let's make some noise." At dawn, I was up and ready. I loaded the hay bales into the pickup and drove to the corral. The horses were already there, watching me with curious eyes. I hopped out, whistled, and slowly spread the hay along the route I'd mapped out. The air was cool, but my hands were sweating. This was it. As I finished, I heard Dave's truck rumble down Karen Street. He was right on time. He waved at me from a distance, then parked in front of her house. I could see Karen coming out, hands on her hips. Already annoyed, I climbed the fence, gave one last whistle, and opened the gate. The first few horses stepped forward cautiously, sniffing the hay. Then, like a wave, the whole herd followed. Their hooves thundered as they moved, their manes flying in the wind. It was a sight to behold, raw, untamed power rolling down the path toward the heart of Karen's perfect, rule-bound world. I stayed back, letting them find their way, my heart pounding like a drum. Today was the day Karen would learn what happens when you bulldoze a man's legacy. The morning sun had just started to burn through the thin layer of mist when I watched the wild horses make their way down the narrow path I'd mapped out. Their hooves thundered like rolling drums, shaking the ground beneath me. It was a sound you don't forget, a mix of chaos and beauty, freedom wrapped in raw power. I stayed a good distance behind, making sure everything went as planned. I'd spent hours setting up barriers with hay bales and temporary wooden rails to guide them straight toward Karen's street without straying into anyone's yard. The last thing I wanted was someone's car or mailbox getting flattened. Dave's voice came through on my phone. "She's out front," he said, chuckling. "I've got her talking about mailbox paint colors. You've got about 5 minutes before she notices the ground shaking." "Perfect," I replied. "Keep her busy." I hung up and whistled a sharp, high-pitched sound my grandfather taught me. The lead mare flicked her ears and picked up her pace, the others following her like a wave of brown, white, and black. Dust rose behind them as they trotted through the final stretch of open land. As soon as they hit the paved road, I jogged ahead to make sure no cars were coming. Most of the neighbors were still inside having breakfast, but one or two peeked through their windows, jaws dropping at the sight of the herd rolling through the neighborhood. Then we turned the corner onto Karen Street. She didn't notice at first, too busy waving her arms at Dave as he pretended to argue about the exact height of his mailbox post. But the sound of hooves hitting asphalt is hard to ignore. By the time she turned around, the lead mare was already stepping onto her perfectly manicured front lawn. Karen froze. "What? What is this?" she shrieked, pointing wildly as the herd began trotting onto her grass, trampling her flower beds, and knocking over one of her ceramic gnome statues. I stopped a few yards away, leaning against the hood of my truck with my arms crossed. "Oh, Karen," I called out, loud enough for the entire block to hear. "Looks like the neighborhood has some new visitors. Don't worry, they're not violating any HOA rules. Yet." Her face turned crimson. You did this. You can't just unleash animals on my property." I shrugged. "Funny. That's exactly what you did with that bulldozer on mine." The herd spread across her lawn, some of them stopping to graze while others stomped through her ornamental rose bushes. Karen was frantically trying to wave them off, but all she succeeded in doing was spooking them, sending 3 of them trotting right up onto her driveway. "Dave, call animal control," she screamed. Dave, bless his soul, was standing there with his phone out, recording the whole thing while pretending to dial. "Sure thing." "Karen," he said with a grin, "but, I don't think they'll get here in time to save your begonias." Neighbors started coming out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. Phones were everywhere, capturing video of Karen running around her lawn in a panic, her pristine landscaping being reduced to a muddy, trampled mess. "You're going to pay for this." She shouted at me, her voice shaking with fury. I took a step closer, my tone calm but firm. "No, Karen, you're going to pay. For my fence. For all the fines and bullying you've put this neighborhood through. You think you run this place, but you don't. Not anymore." She glared at me, but for once, she didn't have a quick comeback. The herd eventually slowed, some wandering back toward the street, nibbling on patches of grass along the way. I grabbed a bucket of feed I'd brought and gave another sharp whistle. Just like my grandfather taught me, the horses followed the food as I led them away from Karen's wrecked lawn. The crowd of neighbors clapped as I walked past, a few of them even cheering. About time someone stood up to her. One man shouted. By the time the last horse left Karen's property, her lawn looked like a war zone, hoof prints everywhere, flower beds shredded, and her prized fountain tipped over. She stood there trembling, her phone in her hand, but instead of calling the cops, she just kept glaring at me like she was trying to figure out how she lost control so fast. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "No," I said, smiling slightly. "It's just getting started." As I loaded the feed buckets back into my truck, Dave walked over and slapped me on the back. "Man, that was beautiful. You should have seen her face when that first horse started eating her roses." "Yeah? Well," I said, glancing back at Karen's yard, "consider this a wake-up call. If she thought I'd roll over, she was dead wrong." That night, videos of the HOA horse invasion started circulating in the neighborhood group chat. By the time I went to bed, half the neighborhood had already seen the footage, and the best part, most of them were cheering me on, but I knew Karen wouldn't stay quiet for long. and I was ready for whatever came next. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. The videos of the wild horses trampling Karen's lawn had spread faster than wildfire. Every neighbor, even the ones who used to keep their heads down, now had something to say. I was sipping my coffee on the porch when Dave showed up, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. He had his phone out, showing me the HOA's group chat. "Look at this," he said, laughing. "Half the people here are calling you a hero. Karen's furious. She's demanding an emergency board meeting tonight." I scrolled through the messages. There were pictures of Karen screaming on her lawn, screenshots of her yelling at animal control, and plenty of sarcastic comments about HOA-approved landscaping. It seemed like the whole neighborhood had been waiting for someone to push back, and now they had their spark. "Good," I said, handing the phone back. "Tonight's the night we end this." The emergency meeting was held at the community center. By the time I arrived, the place was packed. Every chair was taken, and people were standing along the walls. Karen was at the front, pacing like an angry cat. She wore a bright red blazer, probably to remind everyone she was in charge, but her hair looked frazzled, and her eyes were sharp with fury. As soon as I walked in, all conversation stopped. Karen pointed a finger at me like she was accusing me of murder. "There he is, the man who unleashed chaos on our community," she shouted. I stayed calm, walking to the front. "Chaos?" I asked. "Karen, all I did was let nature take a walk. You're the one who bulldozed a 100-year-old fence without permission. Maybe we should talk about that." Geeseps rippled through the crowd. Karen's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. "Your fence was non-compliant," she snapped. "It violated our standards. And you destroyed my property," I interrupted, my voice rising. "And you did it without any vote, without consulting anyone, just because you decided you didn't like it. That's not enforcing rules, that's abuse of power." Several neighbors nodded in agreement. Joe, the Vietnam vet, stood up. "She fined me $200 for having a flagpole that was too tall," he said loudly. "We're sick of her acting like this place is her kingdom." Lisa chimed in, holding up a stack of papers. "I have letters from 6 families here, all of whom were fined or threatened over petty nonsense." "Karen, you've been targeting people just because you can." Karen's eyes darted around the room. "This is slander," she shouted. "I'm just trying to keep our neighborhood beautiful, I said firmly. "You're trying to control people, and you crossed the line when you came onto my property with heavy machinery." I set a folder on the table, opening it to reveal photos of my destroyed fence, along with a copy of the deed showing how long my family had owned the land. "This fence stood for nearly a century," I said, my voice steady. "It was part of my family's history. You didn't just tear down wood. Karen, you tore down a legacy, and you're going to pay for it." The room went silent. People were leaning forward now, watching every word. Karen laughed nervously. "You can't prove anything." "Oh, I can," I replied, pulling out my phone. "Would you like me to show everyone the videos of your bulldozer on my property?" Her smile froze. She hadn't expected that. "Maybe we should take a vote," Dave said, standing up. "We all signed on for an HOA to keep things organized, not to give Karen the power to act like a dictator. Who here wants to keep her in charge?" Only 2 hands went up, Karen's and her friend Marla's. "And who here wants her removed?" Dave asked. Almost every hand in the room shot up. The decision was unanimous. Karen's mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but no words came out. After the vote, I approached the new acting board. "I want full compensation for the damage to my fence," I said, "and I want written confirmation that no one will touch my property again without my permission." "You'll have it," the acting board member replied. "And Karen will be responsible for the repair costs." "We'll make sure of it." Karen stormed out of the meeting, muttering under her breath. As she passed me, she glared, but there was no more fire behind her eyes, just defeat. That night, I sat on my porch with Dave and Joe, sipping a cold beer while the crickets sang in the distance. The air felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. "Well," Joe said with a chuckle, "I'd say the wild horses were worth it." I laughed. "Yeah, but let's hope they don't get too comfortable around people. I think Karen's yard was enough for them. Dave raised his beer. To standing up for what's right. To family, I added, thinking of my grandfather. The fight wasn't over yet. I still had to rebuild my fence, but the battle had been won. Karen was out, and the neighborhood was finally free of her tyranny. The morning after Karen's defeat, I woke to a quiet I hadn't felt in weeks. No angry emails, no HOA letters shoved under my door, no bulldozer engines roaring on my land, just the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the sound of my boots on the porch steps. It felt like the ranch itself was breathing easier, as if my grandfather's spirit was nodding in approval. The first thing I did was call an old friend, Hank, a local carpenter who'd been working on ranches for over 30 years. He knew cedar better than anyone. By noon, he pulled up in his beat-up truck, a trailer full of tools and fresh-cut cedar logs in tow. "You weren't kidding when you said the HOA went nuts," Hank said, running his hand over the splintered remains of the old fence. This was solid work. "What kind of fool would tear this down? One with too much power and no respect for history," I muttered. "But we're fixing it. Better than before. Together." We got to work. The smell of freshly cut cedar filled the air as we replaced the posts and rails, driving each nail deep with the kind of care my grandfather would have demanded. Dave and Joe showed up soon after, offering to help. Even Lisa came by with her kids, handing out cold lemonade and cheering us on. By late afternoon, the new fence was standing tall, every line straight and true. I stepped back, wiping sweat from my brow, and smiled. "Looks like it'll last another 100 years, I said. Later that week, the HOA's acting board called me with the news I'd been waiting for. Karen had been officially removed as president. Not only that, but she'd been ordered to cover the full cost of rebuilding my fence and to pay back every unjust fine she'd issued to other neighbors over the past year. Apparently, the videos of her meltdown with the wild horses had gone viral, reaching beyond our little community. The ridicule had been too much for her to handle, and she'd quietly packed up and left town. I can't say I felt sorry for her. She brought this on herself, but I did feel a sense of closure. Justice, in its own way, had been served. That weekend, I hosted a small cookout at my place. We set up picnic tables near the barn, with the new cedar fence proudly standing behind us like a symbol of victory. Neighbors I barely knew before were now shaking my hand, thanking me for standing up to Karen. Lisa raised her glass of lemonade. "Here's to the man who tamed the HOA," she said with a grin. "More like the man who unleashed the horses," Dave added, chuckling. "You should have seen Karen's face when that mare started eating her roses. Priceless." We all laughed, the kind of belly laugh that comes from knowing you've been through something together and come out stronger on the other side. As the evening wound down, I found myself alone by the fence, watching the sun dip below the hills. The wild horses were out there somewhere, free and untamed, just like they'd always been. I thought about how close I'd come to losing this piece of my family's legacy, and it hit me sometimes standing your ground means more than just defending property. It means defending your values, your history, and the things that make you who you are. I ran my hand over the smooth surface of the new cedar rail and whispered, "We did it, Grandpa. We held the line." Karen's downfall wasn't just my victory, it was the neighborhood's. People started talking again, helping each other, instead of living in fear of fines and letters. It felt like a community again, the way it was meant to be. Before heading inside, I turned to the camera on my porch and hit record. "If you've ever had someone try to bulldoze what's yours," I said, "don't let them. Stand up, fight back, and don't be afraid to get creative. Justice doesn't always come easy, but when it does, it's worth every second of the fight." I paused, then smiled. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are plenty more tales of HOA chaos and justice to come. The screen of my camera blinked off, and I looked out over my land one last time. My fence was standing. My neighbors were united, and Karen was gone for good. Justice had been served, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly at peace. When I look at my ranch now, with the new cedar fence standing strong under the open sky, I feel something deeper than just satisfaction. I feel peace. This land isn't just dirt and wood. It's the story of my family, the sweat of my grandfather's hands, and the lessons he left behind. Karen and her HOA tried to take that away, but they forgot one thing: you can't bulldoze a man's roots. What happened here isn't just my victory. It's a reminder for anyone who's ever been pushed around by people who think they have all the power. Sometimes standing up for what's right takes grit, heart, and maybe even a little wild creativity. But when justice is served, it's worth every ounce of the fight. If this story struck a chord with you, take a moment to think about what's worth standing up for in your life. And if you want to hear more stories like this one where ordinary folks rise up against the odds, subscribe to this channel. Together, we'll keep these stories alive.